Sandwiched between the 1998 and 2002 releases of Metal Gear Solid and Splinter Cell, respectively, was the oft-forgotten Syphon Filter that hit the original PlayStation in 1999. Each title contributed building blocks to the stealth action genre. Metal Gear Solid, with its innovative storytelling and mechanics, set a perfect cadence. Splinter Cell's masterful use of shadows and immersive gameplay laid new ground. Syphon Filter left its own mark on so-called sneak-em-ups, leaning heavily towards the genre's action-oriented qualities while tackling then-contemporary subjects such as bioweapons and shadowy terrorist cells. Many remember the PlayStation franchise's first 3 entries as bonafide classics, yet the 4th release, the Omega Strain, ventured too far from its roots. Dismal reviews and a subpar commercial showing for the Omega Strain brought Syphon Filter's momentum to a sudden stop. Not even the acclaimed PSP installments could restore the series' former glory. The property consequently lay dormant for nearly 15 years before a ray of hope shined on future prospects for protagonist Gabe Logan and the agency, under which he conducted covert operations. That hope manifested via Days Gone, an open-world zombie game that deftly tied the former's outbreak to the programmable virus that PlayStation players tried repressing in years past. A questionably managed Day 1 release and reportedly missed sales targets shifted Days Gone to the sidelines, once more calling Syphon Filter's future into question. Given that key creative forces have since departed developer Bend Studio, it would appear Syphon Filter's long-standing status as little more than a PlayStation classic won't be remedied anytime soon. This is the rise and fall of Syphon Filter. This video was made possible by you. On the 6th of April, we reached out with a difficult message. Our channel was in dire straits, and after fighting all the hardships this platform faced us with, it seemed like there was no future left for us. But you stepped in, extending a helping hand that allowed us to stand tall again. And this documentary that was made entirely possible by the support we received from you through Patreon, Ko-fi, PayPal, and YouTube is living proof of that. We now truly realize what our content means to you, and we can't wait to create even more of it. So if you are seeing this message for the first time and want to help us, a small team of 4 dedicated creatives turn this passion into a full-time endeavor. Your support is absolutely essential. Please check out our Patreon page where supporting us will grant you access to a wide library of exclusive content and rewards. With your backing, we can not only survive, but break new ground and create amazing content we've never made before. Thank you, and we hope you'll enjoy this video.
Dual Shock 新価格サウンドスコープ新型できました。
主人ったらまた何かのカタログもらってきた。
Sony's initial foray into console gaming flew off store shelves when the PlayStation 1 launched in Japan in December 1994. 2 years prior, the company that would become one of its first studio acquisitions set up shop in Bend, Oregon. Originally named Blank Berlin & Company Inc., the Pacific Northwest-based outfit cut its teeth on Columbo's mystery capers and a pair of Dell crossword puzzle experiences. Given its stylized cartoon design and platform gameplay, 1996's Bubsy 3D constituted a leap for the development house, which had then adopted the name Eidetic Inc. The Bubsby adventure additionally marked the first of Eidetics' PlayStation-exclusive projects, though few would remember it fondly. In fact, the platformer had appeared on lists cataloging the worst video games of all time. But the negative reception didn't deter Eidetic from exploring new ideas, nor did it discourage Sony Computer Entertainment from pursuing a closer working relationship. Interestingly, lead designer Richard Ham divulged in a Syphon Filter AMA that a Crash Bandicoot-esque demo for Bubsby 4D convinced Sony to sign Eidetic for another second-party agreement. The genesis of the studio's first post-Bubsy project spawned from a concept by David Gracia, an associate producer at Sony's now-defunct 989 Studios. In detailing the origins of the Syphon Filter name, Ham remembered the idea, in its crudest form, made the rounds at Sony long before Eidetic entered the picture. Grassi initially envisioned a post-apocalyptic, Final Fantasy-like tale wherein Mother Earth reclaimed the world, leaving the last vestiges of humanity with a single energy source: mythical creatures called siphons. Only specific people among the survivors could filter the siphons and give the world a fighting chance. The mythical angle landed on the cutting room floor before Eidetic's involvement, yet the fantastical and futuristic elements remained intact for some time afterwards. When drafting a preliminary iteration of the plot, studio co-founder, the late Mike Berlin, leaned heavily into fantasy, believing the industry, unready for realism when battling supernatural creatures, had proven more exciting. A scrapped time travel narrative subsequently came into play, centering on a kidnapped group of scientists who drove the plot after being taken to a secret underground complex. Their orders? To craft a time machine for a nefarious government entity. However, an in-house push for something Tom Clancy-oriented kept things grounded, as Ham and Gracia, inspired by the latter's love for the Golgo 13 animated film, pitched an assassin as the main character. Concerns about whether players would want to assume the role of the bad guy engendered skepticism. As such, 989 Studios producer Connie Booth offered a compromise in which Eidetic could build a real-world setting with a secret agent at the forefront, an approach based on her lifelong passion for spycraft. Longtime Syphon Filter writer and director John Garvin explained in a Behind the Classics interview for PlayStation blog that Gracia penned a one-page treatment for the new Syphon Filter. Details about a proposed plot were absent from the outline, yet general concepts for settings, gameplay mechanics, and playable hero Gabe Logan had garnered some definition. From there, the goal centered on emphasizing weapons, gadgets, and stealth, all in an attempt to place players in the boots of a super spy. Metal Gear Solid's seminal 1998 outing hadn't arrived by the time Eidetic's stealth game entered production, leaving Ham and other developers to rely on GoldenEye, Tomb Raider, and John Woo films as key points of reference. The crew started by building a rudimentary prototype, featuring a shooting sequence in a subway. Garvin joined the studio 6 months into production as Syphon Filter's art director. His past experience as director on strategy titles like Mission Force, Cyberstorm hardly translated to a realistic third-person shooter with stealth action gameplay. However, no one at Eidetic had comparable skills either. According to Garvin, another key issue stemmed from the fact that the group of around 13 staffers neglected to devise a core plan before entering full production. The espionage motif held the project together, yet little of the nascent story elements saw the light of day since Garvin figured a contemporary tale befit the spy genre better than time travel. About halfway through development then, the art director suggested new ideas that won the approval of studio leads. Garvin concocted the concept of Syphon Filter representing the code word for a deadly programmable virus. He additionally implemented themes from sci-fi literature and films that had, up until that point, received minimal attention in gaming. Yet while fine-tuning the in-universe lore and overarching narrative required a certain level of finesse, several obstacles emerged, many of them resolved with technical shortcuts, crunch, and ingenuity. Without a big-picture vision established, Syphon Filter developers basically knew one thing: fashioning a third-person action game around the fantasy of being a super spy constituted their top priority. Much effort went into presenting the fantasy in a seamless and fun manner, although not every imagined piece fit into the larger puzzle. GoldenEye's influence seeped in through basic gameplay mechanics as well as the approach to objectives and the improved save system. But the original Tomb Raider especially left its mark on the Syphon Filter designers. Richard Ham remarked that Lara Croft's ability to aim with her upper body in one direction while her legs moved in another was transformative, such that he felt Gabe Logan needed to function comparably during gunplay. For all of its inventiveness, though, Tomb Raider's aiming forced players to surrender a certain level of control, considering Lara aimed her pistols in whichever direction she faced. Ham thought it better to give players full control for a dynamic and cinematic gameplay feel, thus begetting Syphon Filter's target locking feature. Taking the fluidity of action a step further, Ham looked to John Woo films and borrowed from them the notion that the protagonist should keep moving or die. That abstraction, combined with the emphasis on realism, saw Ham argue in favor of Gabe succumbing to bullet wounds after only one hit. The lead designer's vision of the combat system also left the player without a health meter. It didn't take long for fellow team members to convince him it wouldn't facilitate fun, hence the addition of flak jackets for health. Ham later recalled his surprise at seeing Rainbow Six for the first time and noticing that a studio had indeed pulled off one-shot kill gameplay. Infinite ammo constituted another area that needed improvement in the shooter genre. Ham imagined a knife would have solved the issue, but its in-game functionality failed to work properly, and the weapon summarily fell by the wayside. While contemplating other infinite ammo-like features, the developers conceived Syphon Filter's iconic taser. The taser, as players came to know it, hatched from an iterative process. Smoke effects were introduced to show the taser had successfully harmed enemies in the distance. As for how users would know when to release the attack button, Eidetic ensured the smoke turned to fire, a nonsensical but fan-favorite development that withstood the test of time.
I've discovered why every mission in this investigation has been compromised. The agency had a leak at the top.
Though Syphon Filter's production cycle enjoyed several high points, the studio encountered rough patches too, enough that the possibility of cancellation reared its head on multiple occasions. John Garvin cited these instances as products of missed deadlines, regularly altered levels, narrative rewrites, reworked gameplay systems, and uncertainty about how to proceed. Fortunately, 989 Studios producer Connie Booth and her supervisor, the late Louis Kelly Flock, had great faith in the project. But such support only provided so much to a scrappy bunch of developers who regularly found themselves needing to cut corners. Speaking to the PlayStation blog, Garvin specifically recalled the first game's janky controls and design, noting that the imperfections weren't internally considered a cause of concern so long as they serviced the fantasy. For example, low-budget renders brought the cutscenes or movies to life, which acted as the storytelling vehicle for exposition. This low-cost solution meant every character had box hands that looked questionable on screen yet had no impact on Eidetic's desire to convey the story through scripted cinematics. Bad movies are better than no movies was the go-to motto. By the same token, gameplay shortcuts guided certain creative decisions. The level wherein Gabe Logan infiltrated a formal event at an expo center represented one such example. To give the scene a semblance of liveliness, palette-swapped NPCs stood around sipping cocktails, simple behaviors made possible by relatively cheap animations. These cost-saving methods proved essential to broadening the title's scope. Hardship still took its pound of flesh, especially in the final year of development. The team spent that span of time working in crunch mode, with everyone adamant about meeting their own high standards and that of their publishing partner, 989 Studios. Even weeks before the scheduled ship date, the developers rearranged levels to improve Syphon Filter's pacing, which disrupted the narrative flow and necessitated additional story rewrites. An unsophisticated game engine, along with PS1's memory constraints, precipitated other noteworthy design-centric shortcuts. The boss battle against Anton Gurdu, for instance, may have taken place inside of a memorial building, yet earlier concepts imagined a parking lot as the backdrop. Concerns about filling the parking lot with cars, blowing up said cars, and limiting the player's movement in an open space guided Eidetic back to the drawing board, as did misgivings about the game engine's inability to handle the incumbent technical demands. The Gurdu fight was further overhauled in response to a Metal Gear Solid trailer that featured a boss character wielding a Gatling gun, the same weapon Gurdu would have used against Gabe. Metal Gear Solid's plucky female agent sidekick, Mei Ling, also pressured Eidetic to rename Gabe's eerily similar partner from Mei Xing to Lian Xing. Cut corners aside, Ham and Garvin prided themselves on never excising major content. The studio of a dozen or so staffers simply didn't have the luxury of cutting stuff. All told, Eidetic managed fine in the end. Garvin and designer Jeff Ross remarked in a 2019 PlayStation Access interview that everyone on staff in the early Syphon Filter days performed 2 or 3 different jobs in order to bring their first AAA project to market. These extensive efforts culminated in a genre-defining adventure that became a certified greatest hit on PS1 with over 1 million copies sold in its first year. Syphon Filter snuck onto the PlayStation 1 in North America in February 1999, followed by European and Japanese releases that summer. Despite substandard graphics and performance issues, most critics showered the game with acclaim. The stealth action gameplay especially garnered high marks. Eidetich's emphasis on supplying players a sizable arsenal of weapons and gadgets earned a round of applause as well. In hindsight, John Garvin said he's most proud of the game's story beats. After all, Syphon Filter broached topics that were largely absent in gaming pre-9/11. He argued that a mission about terrorists blowing up a DC train station may be considered tame by modern standards, but in the late 90s, it pushed the envelope. The team had every intention of pushing it further still when developing Syphon Filter 2. Actually outlining a plan and breaking the story before production began helped in more ways than one. Sometime after the first installment shipped, Eidetich employees enjoyed a week-long vacation. Garvin and Richard Ham used that time to draft a script for the sequel. The two worked independently in the beginning, with Garvin writing a screenplay in a weekend, then collaborating with Ham on the second half of the game. According to the former, these sessions begat the introduction of Syphon Filter 2's Moscow levels and helped the pair craft an ending that boasted more of an espionage bent. Once everyone returned to the office, Eidetich spent the following year building its second covert operation. For the first time, the Syphon Filter creators had a coherent roadmap that laid out the do's and don'ts, and quite a number of those lessons came courtesy of reviews and player impressions from the initial entry. Because the 1999 title sold so well, developers more or less knew their audience loved sneaking through environments, engaging in high-octane action sequences, and facing off against terrorists. The sequel presented PlayStation users with more of the same, though Garvin consciously decided to diversify the main cast, sans the usual stereotypes. Thus, Syphon Filter 2's supporting cast included an American Indian woman named Teresa Lapon, deputy chief at the agency. South African biologist Lawrence Mujuri helped round out the circle of characters in Gabe Logan's orbit. Such additions were hardly a matter of diversity for diversity's sake. Rather, they bolstered Garvin's interest in injecting the experience with a high level of realism not typically seen in Syphon Filter's contemporaries. The writer lamented that character development in PlayStation 1-era titles often took a back seat because game makers assumed players didn't care. Garvin deemed it a grave mistake and argued characters should have clear motivations and navigate levels and objectives parallel to the beat-to-beat narrative moments. To Eidetich's delight, its player base gravitated towards the March 2002 release just as it had the previous installment. The two-player multiplayer mode and the campaign's playable Leon sections altered the formula plenty between games. Save for critiques leveled against the more linear mission design, Syphon Filter 2 seemed a massive stepping stone for the series. A third Syphon Filter entry was a given following the success of Gabe Logan's second set of missions. However, Syphon Filter 3, as fans would come to know it in 2001, played no part in the initial run of plans for the property's continuation. John Garvin claimed an ambitious project to help transition from PS1 hardware to the PS2 had long been on the cards. Richard Ham corroborated as much, recalling how Sony bosses tasked Eidetich with producing a PS2 launch game after Syphon Filter 2 shipped. Ham and others had their hearts set on entering the new generation with Syphon Filter Online, which never exited the pre-production phase. A couple of factors contributed to the studio's interest in designing an online game. For one, Sony promised its partners the 6th-gen console would support a network adapter for online play. Secondly, multiple developers in the Eidetich office gleefully shared their obsession with Counter-Strike and Diablo. Ham envisioned a Syphon Filter experience that seamlessly combined the best of both worlds by dropping players into randomly generated levels. While the design lead focused on workshopping online gameplay, a hardware team dedicated itself to understanding the nuts and bolts of PlayStation 2's network adapter. It was clear R&D for the project would last several months, leaving Garvin and 20 or so of his fellow staffers with a light workload. With that in mind, the writer divided his time between breaking new stories for a third mainline Syphon Filter adventure and the online cooperative experience. R&D's slow progress, mixed with concerns about alienating the install base on PS1, fueled Sony's decision to shelve Syphon Filter Online. As a result, Syphon Filter 3 served two distinct purposes: satiating the PS1 audience that hadn't purchased the new hardware at the time of its release, and resolving loose ends to wrap up the stealth action trilogy. The third installment borrowed nothing from Syphon Filter Online besides the Tokyo setting, though select multiplayer ideas eventually reared their heads again. Sony expanded its first-party stable of studios by acquiring Eidetic in December 2000 and renaming it Bend Studio. A few short months later, during E3 2001, the two companies announced the next project in their partnership, Syphon Filter 3. Details out of E3 confirmed Gabe Logan's return for his final adventure, one he would embark on late in 2001 on PS1. Critics and fans expressed their shock, questioning why a new Syphon Filter would launch on a console whose successor had released approximately 1 year prior. Developers maintained the reasoning was twofold. The PS1's install base of 30 million users in the United States alone was a key contributing factor. In addition, there were reservations about deploying the Super Spy's last mission on a new console that not all franchise faithful could readily access. And based on the information that proliferated in the lead-up to its debut, longtime fans didn't want to miss the third Syphon Filter. The narrative directly followed the events of the sequel, beginning with a flashback-laden prologue in Tokyo, then segueing into Gabe and Leon giving their testimony to a Senate committee in Washington, D.C. Framing the third game around the government's investigation into past events allowed Bend Studio to reflect on the protagonist's long tenure as a secret agent, not unlike the storytelling trappings featured in Tomb Raider Chronicles. Nostalgia and a tip of the hat towards consistent storytelling played their parts too, with one mission in particular placing a spotlight on the Costa Rican rainforest operation seen in the first game's intro sequence. Other Syphon Filter 1-inspired throwbacks further elevated Bend's desire to close out the PS1 era with a bang. The 1999 title had embraced what developers called lean, open-ended gameplay, thereby offering players freedom in terms of how they approached certain situations. Critical praise and positive user feedback indicated most people enjoyed this style of play. However, it left designers with little room to flex their muscles, encouraging the addition of the scripting language Syphon Script in Syphon Filter 2, which let designers tell more of the story in-game. The downside manifested in specially crafted linearity that jettisoned player agency and arguably made the game more difficult than its predecessor. Even enemy encounters bore the hallmarks of careful construction, reducing the combat to frustrating trial-and-error style action. Combining the two differing structures seemed ideal in a world where focus testing hadn't yet been prioritized across the industry. Thus, Syphon Filter 3 toned down the difficulty and revisited nonlinear gameplay such that users could tackle situations from multiple angles. This also applied to playstyles, meaning stealthy players could sneak through encounters, while those who preferred run-and-gun Gabe Logan had a litany of options at their disposal. Notably, Bend progressed this level of decision-making by implementing somewhat of a loose karma system contingent on user behaviors. Designers Jeff Ross and Mike Kurzanovsky told IGN the unnecessary use of lethal force could culminate in unexpected consequences that players would likely regret. And failing to rescue captives during a hostage situation could mean missing out on a weapon unlock or a sudden uptick in difficulty. Improved enemy AI between games amplified the challenge in its own right. Their behaviors designed to react accordingly to the player's preference of stealth or all-out action. Randomized behavior took this a step further. The AI could alter its path after reloaded checkpoints, obliterating the sequel's trial-and-error gameplay while also keeping players on their toes. Syphon Filter 3's 5 minigames similarly benefited from the AI overhaul since an emphasis on avoiding stale interactions prompted developers to program AI routines with dozens of possible configurations. The hope was that players would run through numerous stealth exercises and bomb disposal objectives before stumbling across repeated patterns. While such changes increased replayability, they were developed in tandem with friendly AI advancements. AI improvements became a necessity given the flashback-heavy story which saw a large cast of characters enter the fray. Ross noted in a Q&A discussion with The Pixel Empire that extra characters forced the studio to upgrade its streaming tech and mission planning, a trying line to walk in the long and short term. Characters often needed to exist within the same level, yet not everyone could appear together. And because of asset loading inconsistencies on PlayStation 1, asynchronously loading new models served as but another challenge. As it had in the past, the Bend, Oregon crew managed just fine under circumstances that weren't ideal.
Eventually, Gabe recruited me into the agency.
Yes. To help him with murder, assassination, arms dealing, acts of terrorism, you should
Not Gabe and I. We worked for the greater good. We never committed acts of terrorism.
6 months ahead of Syphon Filter 3's ship date, lead designer Richard Hamm departed the company, leaving Jeff Ross to complete the project with one other designer, an associate producer, 2 or so programmers, and a small number of artists. Every mission and the weapon list had already been set in stone prior to Hamm's exit, but Ross's workload remained daunting. Just a handful of missions were in production before he stepped up as lead designer, and the mini-games hadn't progressed beyond the prototype phase. Obstacles aside, the series veteran considered it a point of pride that the team only cut 2 levels and shipped every mini-game and the multiplayer offering. It wasn't lost on anyone that Syphon Filter 3 represented one of the final PS1 exclusives from the first party. Sony and Bend locked in a September 25, 2001 release date, then ramped up the marketing campaign accordingly. One memorable piece of imagery from the title's promo period was its eerily prescient box art depicting Gabe and Leon donning their agency fatigues while the American flag burned in the background amidst a terrorist attack on the U.S. Senate. The marketing material set the tone, if nothing else. Then, tragedy struck. On September 11, 2001, 2 weeks before Syphon Filter 3's scheduled release, 19 al-Qaeda terrorists hijacked 4 commercial airplanes and led attacks against the United States. Of the 4 planes, 2 were flown into New York's World Trade Center. A third struck the Pentagon in Virginia, and the 4th aircraft, Flight 93, crashed into a field near Shanksville, Pennsylvania, after passengers and crew members tried thwarting the attack. The devastating 9/11 events killed nearly 3,000 people. Suddenly, cover art portraying 2 federal agents defending their country from terrorism in a burning government building no longer felt appropriate. On September 19th, Sony Computer Entertainment America indefinitely postponed Syphon Filter 3, citing concerns that its advertising and packaging may have been too sensitive to introduce during a time of tragedy. The publisher recalled previously shipped copies of the PS1 title, swapping out the box art colloquially known as the 9/11 cover for state imagery of Gabe and Leon in the foreground against a nondescript backdrop. The wait didn't persist for long. Syphon Filter 3 arrived on November 6 that same year, receiving middling scores from critics, while users responded more positively. Unfortunately, the new date wedged the stealth action adventure between 2001's biggest releases, Grand Theft Auto 3 and Metal Gear Solid 2: Sons of Liberty, both generation-defining experiences. GTA 3 hit PS2 on October 22nd. The MGS sequel took the platform by storm on November 13th. As Jeff Ross stressed in the Pixel Empire interview, Syphon Filter didn't stand a chance. IGN drew the same conclusion in its review, writing that Syphon Filter 3 was no Metal Gear Solid 2. In the face of heavy competition, Ben's third stealth endeavor stood tall in many respects. Mini-games and the returning multiplayer mode with its more robust offerings set the stage for a different direction. Meanwhile, new characters helped expand the Syphon Filter universe. But no one could have predicted where the IP would go next, or that its 4th stop would strain subsequent prospects.
Stabilize us, Scott. We're going down.
Hail!
Bend Studio knew another Syphon Filter adventure sat on its docket after shipping the 3rd installment. One question loomed, however. How would the developers reinvigorate the franchise for the 6th console generation? Speaking to GameSpot, technical director Christopher Reese said adapting the series for online play seemed the obvious answer. 4-player co-op rested at the nexus of the concept early on. Senior designer Scott Youngblood explained the 4th iteration also needed to be a culmination of everything Syphon Filter had accomplished. But despite this thinking, the crew initially had no intention of exploring new ideas through its typical single-player lens. Revisiting the shelved Syphon Filter Online endeavor drove the production of what eventually bore the name Syphon Filter: The Omega Strain. The multiplayer-centric project inspired the creation of a revised codebase, since the PS2 allowed the developers to enhance the core experience in ways PS1's memory constraints prevented. Better lighting effects and larger environments originated from surface-level technical improvements. Enemy AI grew in competency, gaining the ability to climb, peek around corners, and partner up. Meanwhile, the player character could hide bodies, interact with the environment to shift the balance of power, and participate in a range of buddy actions with a co-op partner. The idea was to inject the Omega strain with equal parts stealth and action, specifically a balance of the two that the property hadn't yet achieved, and it would tread this ground absent a certain someone in the driver's seat. Instead of Gabe Logan, the Omega strain starred a nameless field agent who users built in a character creator. Gabe still played a critical part, leading the agency following past events that unearthed the self-serving motives of his bosses. Consequently, the user-created rookie obeyed orders from the legendary agent, who recruited them to help track and dismantle terrorist cells around the globe. The titular Omega strain, a deadlier, mutated version of the Syphon Filter virus, rested at the center of the high-stakes plot, with the agency working to uncover the strain's source and remove it from the black market. According to Scott Youngblood, mission design posed the greatest challenge due in no small part to the studio's single-player lineage. The Herculean task had no material effect on the ambitious nature of the Omega strain, though. Creative director John Garvin stated in a 2007 GameSpy interview that the fourth installment was an experiment meant to push the boundaries of online gameplay. He argued it did so by breaking the rules players and the press had grown accustomed to in console gaming. Such rule-breaking materialized through the deliverance of an open-ended online experience that tested each player's problem-solving abilities. The relentlessness of enemy spawns acted as another prime example, in that fully clearing out an area often seemed impossible, therefore giving the Omega strain an arcade-like feel that facilitated the leveling system. Leveling operated on the back of RPG elements, which in turn revolved around substantial online ranking functionality. But Bend purposefully avoided making multiplayer about the individual. Team play proved tantamount to progress, even though users could enjoy the Omega strain in a single-player capacity. The developers walked a tightrope in this regard, yet no one clarified why until after the game shipped. Interestingly enough, pre-release controversy later warped some of the original intent anyway.
Поэтому надеюсь, что вы будете слушать внимательно. Нет, это идиот! Известно под названием «Корова».
Sony unveiled the Omega strain in March 2003 alongside a Game Informer cover story wherein fall 2003 garnered mention as the targeted launch window. Bend Studio billed the title as the conclusion for the virus mystery, but assured fans it by no means marked the franchise's final curtain call. Multiplayer ruled the conversation throughout the promotional period, with developers especially talking up the squad-based gameplay, peer-to-peer online capabilities, and broadband support. Still, the story-oriented aspects quickly overshadowed all else. The Omega strain's E3 2003 showing exhibited a level, coincidentally, set in Toronto during a devastating viral outbreak mere weeks after 360-plus cases of a SARS outbreak rocked the real-world metropolis. This eerie parallel generated buzz, but Sony and its Oregon-headquartered subsidiary received the most heat due to the project's inclusion of the fictitious Quebec Liberation Front, an in-universe terrorist group. Originally, the fourth Syphon Filter opened in a Toronto mall where players would encounter dozens of deceased civilians, all infected by the eponymous virus. A subsequent mission tasked users with leaping onto a moving subway train to defuse a bomb set by the fictional terrorist cell. The premise hit too close to home for Canadian officials. Pressure on Sony to remove the content in question mounted from two sides. On one hand, the Toronto Transit Authority took umbrage with its subway system representing the backdrop for a simulated act of terrorism. Government officials in Quebec were displeased with the Quebec Liberation Front name and the player's objective to kill citizens of the province. Front de Libération du Québec, FLQ for short, was the only separatist group from Quebec to ever employ violent tactics, though their targets never reached beyond the province's borders. Throughout the 1960s and into the 70s, the historical FLQ believed violence constituted the only path to secure sovereignty for Quebec. Numerous bombings and other acts of terror were committed as a result. It all precipitated the 1973 kidnapping of British Trade Commissioner James Cross and the murder of Quebec Minister Pierre Laporte. The remembrance of these crises were what spurred critiques from Canadian officials. Late in October 2004, Canadian newspaper The Globe and Mail published comments from Jean Dorion, head of the Société Saint-Jean-Baptiste du Montréal, wherein he argued that it was hard not to feel targeted when there's a game where you shoot at Quebecers. Political party of the Bloc Québécois said the Omega strain bordered on hate propaganda. Sony conceded, agreeing to cut the Toronto subway attack and every reference of the fake group. The whole ordeal floored Syphon Filter creative director John Garvin, who told TotalGames.net that Bend always remained cognizant of not referencing real terrorist groups. Speaking to the Globe and Mail, Garvin also expressed confusion about why the matter had evolved into an international crisis that unfortunately fell into his lap. The Omega strain eventually launched on PS2 in March 2004 to the lowest review scores in franchise history. While it outsold Syphon Filter 3, the first two installments reigned supreme in terms of commercial success. Who knows how well the Omega strain may have performed critically and commercially had Sony Bend gotten to fulfill its original vision. During the preview period, critics and hopeful players were led to believe levels in the Omega strain had been designed to accommodate its single-player and multiplayer offerings equally. Garvin set the record straight years later when telling GameSpy the 2004 installment wasn't well understood. He most notably disclosed that the game's delay came at Sony's behest, as its executives instructed the team very late in development to shoehorn in a single-player experience. In the Syphon Filter AMA featuring Richard Hamm, Garvin shared the blame for the Omega strain's weaknesses, his one regret being a failure to realize fans would have preferred to play as Gabe Logan. Hamm accepted partial blame as well. After all, his fever dream of producing an amalgam of Syphon Filter, Counter-Strike, and Diablo laid the foundations for the Omega strain, an ambitious endeavor the studio built in his absence. That the title neglected the DualShock 2 controller's dual analog sticks in favor of the classic target lock system further contributed to its shortcomings. All in all, a series of minor annoyances amounted to enough grievances that left a bad taste in the mouths of those convinced Syphon Filter had reached its end in some capacity. There were still angles of the Gabe Logan story worth exploring, though. In so doing, Bend Studio walked the path least expected.
We're going to die. We are all going to die.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the latest addition to the PlayStation family.
May 2003 saw Sony Computer Entertainment announce the PlayStation Portable, a Game Boy competitor that SCE President and CEO Ken Kutaragi described as the Walkman of the 21st century. Specs for the PSP later confirmed the device's ability to run first-gen PS2 titles, plus its network system sported wireless LAN and infrared wireless communication abilities. In other words, Sony's first handheld packed quite the punch for its time. While the public waited patiently for PSP news ahead of its 2005 release in North America, the Syphon Filter creators toiled away on a new Gabe Logan adventure. Technical director Christopher Reese explained in an IGN sit-down that production on Syphon Filter Dark Mirror began when the PSP was introduced. Excited by the possibilities, the crew at Bend determined how best to leverage the platform specifications. The endeavor's success hinged on the deliverance of a true console experience that players could enjoy in the palm of their hands. As such, while the PS2 provided the basis for Dark Mirror's prototyping phase, the project was designed for PSP. All animations were reworked from scratch, permitting improvements to classic behaviors like Gabe's stealth walk. Dark Mirror additionally instituted brand new actions, such as the snap to cover maneuver. Of course, PSP's hardware boasted limitations, chief among them the lack of two analog sticks. A single thumbstick forced Bend to think outside the box and devise several controller types that emulated a dual-stick approach and proved easily accessible. Opinions on whether or not Dark Mirror's controls held their own varied as time went on. Richard Hamm would later tell John Garvin the first PSP game felt too stop and start, thereby abandoning his original vision of "you keep moving or you die." Garvin attributed this to the single-stick gameplay, which shooters of the day had largely forsaken as Turok's innovations with analog aiming paved the way for dual-stick layouts. On top of implementing new ways to play, Dark Mirror revisited the franchise's roots. Classic weapons like the M16 assault rifle and M79 grenade launcher were back in action and mixed well with the new weaponry. The MB-150 sniper rifle, for instance, engendered a range of opportunities via specialized darts. One such ammo type came in the form of armor-piercing rounds, a second packed in remote detonated explosives, and the third dart functioned as a long-range taser. Likewise, previously unseen gadgets entered the fray, reinvigorating the gameplay with the rapid traversal line, a zip line yielding tactical advantages in midair. These efforts also serviced Dark Mirror's play-as-you-want motif. Akin to Syphon Filter 3, Dark Mirror empowered stealthy players and implemented nifty melee and knife attacks that didn't feature in older entries. Charging into a level guns blazing embodied another possible style of play. But on the heels of the Omega strain, the real test rested in how the Gabe Logan starring story would pick up the pieces when it had been an afterthought 2 years prior.
We can't wait. Tell them we'll do it.
So far, so good.
Unveiled for the PSP in December 2005, Dark Mirror promised intense gun combat, puzzle-solving gameplay, 30-plus minutes of cinematics, and ad hoc and infrastructure-compatible multiplayer. Series diehards were most interested in the single-player campaign, fashioned as a new storyline to leave the virus behind. In broadening the Syphon Filter mythology and tying up loose ends, Dark Mirror reinstated Gabe as lead, his first mission dispatching him to an oil refinery in Alaska. As the tale progressed, Gabe unraveled a plot spanning far beyond the confines of crude oil distillation. The inclusion of new character Addison Hargrove, who happened to be the special agent's old flame, also shifted expectations, further accentuating the significance of Gabe's return by weaving in personal stakes. Yet, not every idea made the final cut. During the AMA with Richard Hamm, John Garvin revealed the vision for Dark Mirror originally eclipsed the scope permitted by a handheld game. And some ideas were shelved over questions of functionality. Notably, the opening mission featured a cutscene with Leon driving a snowcat while Gabe fired a turret at enemies. The developers wanted to make the turret section playable initially. Skepticism over whether Syphon Filter would feel right with rail shooter gameplay culminated in the use of a cinematic. Regardless of the trimmed-down content, what shipped in March 2006 earned the IP its best reviews since Syphon Filter 2. Franchise faithful without a PSP later enjoyed Gabe's return as well, courtesy of a September 2007 PS2 port. Having broken ground as a PS2 quality game on handheld, Dark Mirror's actual home console debut launched with extra bells and whistles, the biggest difference being the application of dual analog sticks. Other enhancements included widescreen support and up-resed textures. However, the multiplayer suite remained exclusive to the portable system, a decision partly inspired by an interest in keeping the price down. The audience for the final Syphon Filter would be similarly split between the two platforms.
The UN's breached the perimeter. I'm going in.
Good luck.
Thanks. I'm gonna need it.
I've written all the stories since Syphon Filter 1, so I've been doing it for 10 years now. And I felt it was time to bring in somebody new, bring in some fresh blood, bring in some fresh insight into the characters.
After writing the first 5 games, John Garvin thought it wise to bring in a fresh perspective for Syphon Filter's second PSP outing, Logan's Shadow. Connie Booth, the Sony executive who'd pitched the secret agent motif, put the works of Greg Rucka on Garvin's radar. Perhaps best known at the time for the Atticus Kodiak novels and award-winning comics like Gotham Central, Rucka caught Booth's eye with his modern espionage comic book series, Queen and Country. Much of his writings seemed to align with the direction Syphon Filter was headed, particularly with respect to the heavier emphasis on character. Greg Rucka clarified his role in a GameSpot interview, explaining that Booth and Garvin first asked him to review preliminary plans for the story of Logan's Shadow. Despite having no familiarity with the brand, the writer agreed and pored over the material, taking special interest in the reams of information Garvin had written for the Syphon Filter universe. Gabe Logan learning he had a daughter at the end of Dark Mirror intrigued Rucka the most. Upon hearing there were no intentions of delving deeper into that narrative thread, the novelist knew his job would center on the emotional content of Logan's Shadow. Rucka applauded the character work on Gabe, Leon, and Teresa, yet argued the games had merely scratched the surface. Considering the popularity of Stop the Terrorist stories, he figured immersing players through the emotional reasoning behind certain motivations could elevate both Syphon Filter and the medium. To Rucka, deepening the relationships between the IP's key figures was just what the doctor ordered. Logan's Shadow thus positioned Leon as the driving force in a tale wherein she stood accused of conspiring with foreign powers as a double agent. Sony and Bend Studio teased story details for Logan Shadow during its official announcement at Gamers Day 2007. The promise of fan-favorite weapons and gadgets returning from Dark Mirror sparked anticipation, but developers insisted Gabe would resurface with at least a few new tricks up his sleeve, including the ability to blind fire behind cover. QuickTime events entered the fray too, opening up potential story paths based on whether players passed or failed the sequence. In addition, underwater gameplay shook up the status quo, so much so that Bend crafted new weapons for Gabe's dive into the Indian Ocean. Again, Bend Studio demonstrated its prowess at producing console-quality handheld experiences. Logan Shadow snuck onto the PSP in October 2007, then migrated to PlayStation 2 in 2010. Each version received high praise. Still, the cliffhanger ending, which implied Gabe Logan was killed in action, left the door open for subsequent missions. Bearing that in mind, many couldn't believe that instead of developing a seventh Syphon Filter, Bend Studio led the charge in adapting Insomniac's Resistance franchise for the PSP. John Garvin later told IGN in a studio retrospective that he and the team were itching to try something else. Resistance's monstrous aliens constituted a welcome respite from years of espionage games. In a discussion on Reddit, former Bend artist Athy Morovitz claimed Syphon Filter ultimately burned Garvin out, hence the protagonist's presumed death in Logan Shadow. Bend didn't completely walk away from its espionage-oriented universe, though. Following years of fits and starts on other projects, the development house unleashed Days Gone on PS4 in 2019, inviting PlayStation owners to play a biker navigating a zombie apocalypse. But Days Gone's zombies or freakers weren't ordinary undead creatures. Information found throughout the game pointed to the in-universe health crisis spawning from the Syphon Filter virus. While developers confirm the connection, nothing suggests the marriage of these two properties will be explored in full, considering Sony's rejection of a Days Gone 2 pitch. Lead developers John Garvin and Jeff Ross, both of whom have since exited the studio, divulged in a discussion with God of War creator David Jaffe that a possible Syphon Filter reboot was on the table post Days Gone. Absent interesting ideas, Garvin and company shelved the series yet again. Franchise veteran Richard Hamm once shared where he'd like to see the story go next, proposing that perhaps the events of Logan Shadow paralyzed Gabe. A hopeful seventh game would feature him as the Oracle to Leon and Teresa's Batman, placing the legendary agent in a man-in-the-chair type of role. However, Hamm, like Garvin, stands far removed from the happenings at Bend Studio. And Syphon Filter, for all of its innovations with stealth action, dodge rolls, headshots, and so on, has almost faded into obscurity, only resurfacing thanks to the studio's support of the PS Classics catalog. If ever Gabe Logan returns, it will be to a world where the novelties of Syphon Filter have become commonplace. A world where being good enough on a growth-obsessed AAA market no longer fosters sequels and second chances. Thank you for watching our video. We'd like to take this time to thank, by name, the generous Patreons who have pledged to our Hall of Fame reward tier. Disco Cobra 2013, Ice Cold Water $1, Karu, Sauerkraut, Shuan Chinwin, and those currently subscribed to our producer reward tier: Adam Miller, Brock Piviroto, Darirap Sigurdsson, DCX NG, DJ Redden, Eric Bedio, Fallen Asterisk, It's Peanut Butter, Jake, Jan Christofferson, Matthew McLaughlin, Roberto Nieves, Sir Alex, C. Rob Kaysen, Taylor Moten, your B. If you enjoy our content, please consider subscribing to our channel and backing us on Patreon.